we don't know where politics will lead. And so I am hopeful. I don't think it will be soon, but I'm hopeful that someday he'll be brought to justice.
Your reaction then, Kat? This is a regime, as we all know, that murdered your sister. How do you feel today?
I'm just absolutely thrilled. I'm really stunned at the progress in the news in the last week and how quickly the rebels were able to take back their country. Hoping really both for a peaceful path forward for Syria, but also that Assad can be truly brought to justice.
I mean, we're hearing reports even now that he's in Russia.
Which would make him hard to get at.
Yeah. But tell us what happened, because when your sister died, you went through a long period of trying to establish who was responsible for her death, and a court in the US recognized it was his regime.
We did. We had hoped to bring it in The Hague to let in more plaintiffs from all over the world, and particularly Syria and others who were killed and wounded in the attack. The only place we were able to bring the lawsuit was DC District Court. And a really significant reason I wanted to do that was to amass evidence that could hopefully be used in a criminal trial. And, thousands and thousands of pages were smuggled out of Syria, translated, and are all available if hopefully one day they'll come to be useful.
And explain what you believe happened. You believe that your sister was targeted as a journalist by the regime, and they took her out because she was a journalist and because she was so committed to reporting what was going on in a place like Homs.
Absolutely. I mean, we were able to prove it beyond a doubt, including not just documentation from the Office of the President, but firsthand accounts of individuals who were even involved and others who are aware of what was going on. But internal memos documenting it, there's absolutely no doubt that she was targeted and murdered, along with thousands and thousands of others. One aspect of this offensive that I found really hope-inspiring, and I was thrilled that they're releasing political prisoners, including journalists. No word yet on Austin Tice, the American who's been held for 12 years, but very hopeful that he'll be found safe and freed.
Do you think that I mean, obviously Assad was primarily reinforced by Russia and Iran. Do you think the West generally were too accepting of the need for stability in the area, and they more or less acquiesced in his reign and the abuses that took place in his name by his regime?
I was really disappointed in my country that we didn't take a more active role and at least enforcing a no-fly zone. I felt the Syrians were just easy targets for those Russian fighters. Brilliant timing, though, on this offensive, when Russia's weakened, Iran, Hezbollah are weakened and distracted. So, yes, I think we all took our eye off the ball. And yes, I think that the West should have been less complacent and more attentive. But we are where we are, and I'm just thrilled the Syrians took matters into their own hands and were able to free their country from this tyrant.
And why was reporting from Syria so important to Marie? Because she could have, and indeed in many people's eyes, could have happily left the country, could have protected herself, should have protected herself in some people's minds. She refused to leave the story. Why did she care so much? Why did this matter so much to her?
It's interesting, and Marie and I talked about this many times, where she would very quickly assess a situation and decide, understanding the danger, is the story worth it? And sometimes the answer would be no. But in this case, Marie just felt so strongly that these voices needed to be heard, and there were, so few voices out of Syria then that when she went back in with Paul Conroy, she believed so deeply in giving a voice to the voiceless. And the Syrian rebels at that time, back in early 2012, were not being heard and not being represented.
Did she know that that the regime wanted to kill her.
Oh, I have no doubt that she knew that. And even in her last broadcast, I think, from what Paul tells me, she was aware that broadcasting that last call was with Anderson Cooper, I think, was putting her and him at risk. And it was, as I understand from Paul, it was a discussion at the time, and they judged it, worth the risk.
Now, Assad is in Russia, we believe, certainly as of Sunday night when we're having this conversation. We're sure. I mean, that was always where he was liable to go. Putin is a war criminal himself, and so there's an interesting question. When all of these things get talked about, can you ever really bring people like this to justice? Assad is not going to make himself available. Putin is not going to make himself available. Do you have no hope? Do you hold out some hope? What do you make of the two of those together in Russia?
I have very little hope. But he's a relatively young man, and I say that as a relatively young woman. So he's got quite a few more years. We don't know where politics will lead, and so I am hopeful. I don't think it will be soon, but I'm hopeful that someday he'll be brought to justice.
And just finally, Kat, this is a very complicated conflict. I mean, what's happened to Syria over the last century is a very complicated history. You have got rebels. You have people who are connected to terrorist organizations. You see some people being very optimistic, saying this could be, this is a tyrannous regime, 30 odd years in the making, that's now been toppled, the conclusion of the Arab Spring that was begun 15 years ago. And others are saying the people who end up in charge of Syria could be extremists. They could be anti-women. They could be anti-peace. They could be jihadists. How do we tell the story of what's happened? It's going to be very difficult in the next 24 hours, and then the next days and weeks to come. How do you try and tell a story like this? This is what Marie would have been interested in herself, I would imagine.
Yeah, and we can't see the future, and all of those things are possible. But I feel like the early signs are very positive. There's jubilation. There's not looting, other than tearing down these statues of Assad, and even the messaging coming from the rebel leadership seems to be more moderate than earlier, in the conflict, and even cooperation with the prime minister. So I'm actually hopeful. I think the early signs are very positive. I believe deeply in the Syrian people's desire for peace and freedom, and I think they've been loud and clear about that. I'm really inspired by the hope that they were able to maintain over these long 13 years. And so I really do think there is a path for peace. And I truly hope I'll be able to go visit homes, and it will be rebuilt and beautiful. And I am an optimist, but I understand the concern of the critics, but right now I just think we should all be celebrating their victory.
And do you think your sister would agree with you?
I'm sure she would. I think we'd be raising a glass.